Worship is responding to the worthiness of God, but it's responding to the worthiness of God in a worthy manner. And so then we have to, how are we going to define that?
Welcome to Jesus in the Upper Left, where we're talking about gospel multiplication in the Pacific Northwest.
So welcome, Andre and Brian, to the Jesus in the Upper Left podcast. So we're kind of even doing a little test run for Andre being a co-host and helping out with things. He just recently started working with me at Brilliance Labs. Andre, why don't you just take a moment and introduce yourself? And I know, Brian, you've met Andre before, right?
Yeah.
So, but yeah, just introduce yourself a little bit, and then we'll jump into our talk with Brian.
I don't know how much of an introduction you want,
Dude, well, whatever you got, man.
All right. Well, my name's Andre. Most of my life has been in the Portland area, so I've grown up around here. I was born in the former Soviet Union, immigrated to the States, learned all about America and American culture and Western culture in Portland, only to find out as a teenager and in my young adult years that this is not at all representative of the rest of America or Western culture for that matter. But yeah, the Lord graciously saved me when I was 21 years old. And from the moment that he saved me, I was just in love with the church. And I knew that with whatever I was doing in life, I wanted to be as plugged into ministry as I could. So I've done a variety of different ministries, everything from outreach, work with folks struggling with addiction, a lot of youth ministry, high school ministry, college, young adult, working with young families, that kind of thing. A lot of my experience has been working with Russian-speaking, Slavic, Ukrainian, Russian, Belarusian, whatever folks. And so, working with large immigrant populations in the Pacific Northwest and in Southern California for a while. But yeah, I'm a church member at Trinity Church of Portland. I work for Brilliance Labs part-time I'm the Pacific Northwest Programs Director. And then I work part-time at Trinity. I'm on staff as a pastoral assistant. So I have the privilege of preaching, teaching, working with folks, working with the leadership team. And I'm married. I get to spend my life with my dear bride, Kaitya. And we've been married for 12 years. So life is good. The Lord's been very kind to me.
Awesome. Stoked to have you here. And now, Brian, you were sent out from Trinity Church, right?
This is correct, yeah.
Yeah. So, and you planted Saving Grace
So
Church?
it's a revitalization. So a church that had been around since the 60s, went through different names, but was known as Westwood Community Fellowship at the time that I came. But as we merged kind of two groups of people together, we changed our name to something that was more fitting to the direction we were going. Yeah. So, but yeah, it was a revitalization. There was about 35 saints who were there at the time that I came. Their previous lead pastor had passed away. Most of those saints were over 65. But then about 35 people from Trinity came with me, mostly under 35. So it was this melding of, two different generation groups. Yeah.
Wow. Awesome. Okay, so we're starting this series on worship, and so we want to dive into that. But you have a particular background in performing arts and hip-hop. So I'll let Andre kind of start that conversation, and then we want to see how does that affect and influence your unique views of worship in the church.
Yeah, so I wanted to hear what drew you to hip hop when you got into music. What was it about hip hop, and beyond the drawing effect, what was getting into music at first? What was that like?
Yeah, I mean, generally for me, my personality, whatever I was into, I wanted to actually do it. So when I was a fan of WWF wrestling, I wanted to wrestle. And then I went to my first wrestling practice, and I was like, this is not what they do on TV, because it was just regular, collegiate style wrestling, So I was like, no, I wanted to do the Ultimate Warrior. But I got into basketball, and it's like, man, I'd be watching a game. I couldn't wait till halftime because I wanted to go out to the driveway and shoot hoops myself, right? And so with that similar thing, I was exposed to some hip hop when I was young, and, I'm older now. So, I'll kind of date myself, but, remember hearing like Crisscross, MC Hammer in like 91, late 80s to 91. So more just kind of pop level, and it was fun, and I was kind of interested in it. And then living on the West Coast, from there, most of the hip hop I was exposed to was more like gangster rap, which it didn't seem like something that I myself could do. So I was just like, oh, that's interesting. So I started getting into like 93, I was getting into more garage bands, things like that. This is like the era of like Green Day, Offspring, Nirvana, Weezer. They're kind of putting out their first albums. I had a friend who was playing guitar. I'd try and like sing, and I was like, yeah, I don't really know how to express myself this way. But I ended up getting the album Midnight Marauders by Tribe Called Quest somewhere like late 93, early 94. And I was like, oh, like what they're rapping about, just making music, being young, life stories, things like that. It was so intriguing to me because even though I'd never been to Linden Boulevard, I had no idea what life was like, in their borough. I started getting a sense of it from the music. And so the amount of words that were used in a hip hop song, instead of it just telling me like, let's party or let's do this, or it was describing just much more normal life and feelings and emotions. And once that happened, it just like clicked for me. Oh, this is an avenue through which I could explore like expressing myself, expressing what I've experienced, what I'm feeling, what I'm thinking about. And then once that happened, it was like just my interest in hip hop. And what's really interesting is on that Midnight Marauders album, you have all these faces that is on the album cover, and it was all these other artists. And when you look in the liner notes, it's like, oh, that's Busta Rhymes, that's this person, that's this person. And so it was like not just an introduction to Tribe Called Quest, but to all these other artists. And so I just became fascinated with like building my tape collection. And it seemed like the more I was exposed to new artists, the more I was being exposed to life in different places, people's different upbringings and lived experiences, even the different ways that MCs would try and prove that they were better than others. They all had their own style to them. So I was just immersed in it from there.
Yeah, that's great. I'm not at all a rapper, but I grew up on hip hop. I love hip hop. And interestingly, it was Tribe that was kind of pivotal for me too.
Okay.
I got a couple of hip hop tapes when I was like in third grade. And, I'd sneak them into the house and listen to them in my very, very conservative Slavic Christian household. But I remember it was a little bit later with Tribe for me, but it was Beats, Rhymes, and Life.
Yeah.
And then listening, and then that introduced me to kind of like Dilla's production and going out from there. But I remember when I visited your old Humble Beast studio, and I was walking by your office, and I saw a Mad Villain figurine.
That wasn't mine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that kind of, seeing those kinds of influences of like Tribe, Madlib, Mad Villain, Doom, all of that.
Because that would have been more Cortland's influence, because he's a few generations. He was like younger than us. So a lot of his influences were like from the era when I started making music versus like when I was a fan of music. Yeah.
So who was, other than Tribe, who was like influential for you either stylistically or musically? And I also wanted to talk to you about your hip hop name, Braille. Tell me the story behind that.
Yeah, starting with Tribe and kind of, I think at the time, since most of my perception of a lot of West Coast rap was more gangster rap, whether you're talking about, NWA, Snoop Dogg, things like that. Once I was exposed to Tribe Called Quest, I started realizing, okay, a lot of the older hip hop didn't have so much of the gangster emphasis, and so I just gravitated towards East Coast. Eventually I discovered like West Coast groups like Far Side and Alcoholics and stuff like that. And so my influence was pretty broad in that sense, but I would say from like my initial interest, I was kind of on the internet when the internet was new, So I remember being on like AOL dial-up and starting to get underground tapes and stuff. And it seemed like maybe I was a sophomore in high school and I was getting exposed to a lot of underground rap being made by college age artists who were inspired by some of the same artists that I was, but they didn't have record label backing and, things like that. So it was a little more rough around the edges. And I think that further inspired me of like, oh, I don't have to wait to get signed to try and do this. I can just sit here in Portland, Oregon and like start making tapes myself and things like that. But I would fail if I forgot to mention though, one of the things just in the Lord's kindness, through a mutual friend, I met this guy in Salem, Oregon. His name was Iltrip, and he was probably, when I was 15, he was probably like 24 or something. He's like 9 years older than me. And he had a little 4-track setup in his dining room, but he made beats and everything. And he was making his own tapes and making his album covers at Kinko's and stuff. And I learned from him even before I was on the internet. So I like fast forwarded, but I learned from him, I can actually I don't have to wait, to begin making my own music. So that was really, really cool that like a older dude invested in me when I was young. But yeah, within that realm, then trying to understand my name, I'm listening to these college age, artists that have vocabulary and they're expressing complex ideas and stuff. And so, when I started working with this guy, Iltrip, we like formed a little group, another guy from Eugene. And it's like, you got like, they're all in their early 20s and I'm this 15-year-old, but I'm like, hey, let's make an album, And I think that was the thing. I was just a go-getter. Like, I don't want to just, say I'm interested in this. I actually want to do it, And so I would kind of put that energy behind other people who are like, well, yeah, we want to do it too. Oh, we're going to do it for real. So we formed this group like Mentors of the Aurora, which was like a name I came up with. And then I was like, okay, what if we each had different names specific for the group, So I'm like, okay, you're Parallel and you're Prototype and I'm Perplex, So I'm coming up with these different things. And eventually I was like, Perplex the Cerebration Bazaar, which is basically just like confusing brain action. It's like this idea that, my lyrics are so deep, you struggled to comprehend them, again, because, I'm listening to this stuff. And that eventually adjusted, and I probably had like one of the longest rap names ever. I was Perplex for the Mind, Braille for the Soul. So it was this idea of like confuses your mind, but you feel it inside, And then I shifted over to like Braille, the Suction Cup, Ohm. I won't even try and explain, but I eventually landed on Braille. And really what the idea ended up being was when you meet someone, like you could be really sad right now and I could make assumptions about why you're sad, but it would be your communication of what's behind the emotion that would help me to understand you better. So it's one thing to understand, okay, this person is sad. It's another thing to know why are they sad, right? Or if you had a scar on your face, I can look at you and be like, oh, dude's got a scar on his face. But it's going to be communication that's going to tell me the story of how that scar got on your face because I wasn't there when it happened. And I started realizing like in music, I like helping people to understand the things they can't see. You weren't there when this happened, but let me tell you about it, right? And then as I started growing in my faith, I'm like, yeah, and there's a spiritual dimension. There's this unseen God who's at work in our lives and we don't see him, but we see the effects of his work, right? And so that eventually kind of, by like age 16 or 17, it was like, Braille, helping people understand the things they can't see, personal stories, emotions, and spiritual reality.
That's great, man. So starting from the age of 15, really, you were already writing, recording. You ended up touring pretty extensively, obviously, beautiful eulogy, all of your solo work. Talk to me about the transition from being a recording artist, traveling, touring, playing big shows, et cetera, onto, I think I want to be a church planner. I think I want to be a pastor. This is where I want my energy to go.
Yeah. I mean, going back with my testimony. So I was exposed to the gospel somewhere around age 13, 14. I think by 14, I was identifying as a Christian, but I didn't grow up in a Christian home. Parents were divorced. The only time I'd ever been in a church building was, I have a close friend, his mother passed from cancer. And so the first time I was ever in a church building would have been like in middle school, going to my friend's mom's funeral. So that's like how unchurched I was. But I remember I was throwing a football with my stepdad, and I asked him, if God created everything, who created God? And as I can remember the story, he caught the football, he said, I don't know, and he threw it back to me, right? But eventually, like, I met a guy, and he was talking to me about, there is a God. Does your family go to church or whatever? And I came away from that conversation with the most basic understanding of the gospel, that God created me. I'm accountable to him. I'm guilty before him because of my sin. And he sent his son who died on the cross so that my sins could be forgiven. And like, in God's kindness, I didn't just hear that, I believed it. I had no discipleship. I wasn't in a church. My family moved to New Jersey going into my junior year of high school. And so music, having no discipleship, music was how I was trying to understand my lived experience and trying to explore my faith, because I wasn't really understanding it from being discipled, being in a local church. So by the time I was done with high school, it was like I already had invested so much time and energy into building this muscle, building this reflex. It's like, I don't want to go to college. I just want to make music, I put out a lot of tapes, but like my first official album came out during my senior year of high school, 1999. It was called Life First. And so I already started having relationships, things like that. So eventually my family moved back to Portland. I just get on a Greyhound bus, go to LA, crash on somebody's couch, make music. And once I started that, I never worked a job again since high school. So I just did music from year 2000 to 2018. The change that happened to me, though, is I always took my faith serious, but I would say I wasn't necessarily growing a ton. I was growing through the residual effects just of knowing the Lord over time. But I continued to lack intentional discipleship for most of my Christian life. A lot of the preaching that I sat under was either topical or mystical. I won't over-explain what I mean by that, but nonetheless, it's just I wasn't learning how to read my Bible for myself. And so I knew the gospel saved me. I knew I was supposed to like try and do things that were pleasing to God. I just didn't understand how all these things related. So I was very like self-determinative, to try and live a faithful Christian life. A lot of things in my life kind of like nosedived in 2010, which was like a series of events. Like my first daughter was born 2006, but with like major complications. I'm an artist. I don't have any medical insurance. And I got all these hospital bills. Then my father passes away in 2007. The economy goes into a recession, 2008. I sell my first home that I, built up my whole thing. I was married. My wife left me and my daughter. I became a single father. And so these sequence of events put me in a position going into 2010 where I was like, dude, I either lean into the Lord or I fall away from him. It was like, I can't just go the way I've been going, like just trying my best. And so I leaned into the Lord, and the Lord met me there. And I started sitting under careful preaching that was teaching me how to read the Bible. So I like went back to like just actually trying to read it for myself. I'm like, oh, so an epistle is a letter written to a church. How could I be a Christian for 14 years and not know that, right? Yeah. But that's just, I wasn't being taught those kind of things. And so all of a sudden the Bible just started making sense to me. I saw the Christ-centeredness of Scripture. I saw the gospel-centeredness of the Christian life. I saw the church or the corporate shape of the Christian life, that the gospel creates something. And so as I'm learning these things, I'm still doing concerts like I've always been doing, but just out of the overflow of my own heart, I'm now preaching the gospel more explicitly, more clearly in my concerts. And I've got people coming to me and they're saying things like, man, I haven't heard the gospel clearly articulated in such a long time. And I'm like, well, I know you're coming to my show. Probably you're already a Christian, which means you're probably already in a church. It just means probably your experience is a lot like mine, where you've been in churches where you have not been being taught the gospel and you haven't been being taught just how to read the Bible. And I'm like, man, the Lord has seen fit to teach me these things. It would be inappropriate for me to withhold them from others. And so I just started sharing with others what I was learning. Others seemed to benefit. And so I got to a point where I was like, well, Lord, if this is what you want me to focus on, I'm willing to do it. It'd just be a succession of him opening doors. I started becoming more and more disillusioned with being an artist. As I got remarried, had more kids, my desire to travel became less and less. As the popularity of Beautiful Eulogy increased, I was like, there's things that are cool about this, but there's also things that are just really weird. And again, it's great that I can show up in somebody's city and be an encouragement to them, but I knew what I really lacked was that spiritual formation of discipleship and someone walking alongside me. And I just became more and more compelled that if the Lord would have me to play that role in other people's lives, that's what I'd like to do. A door opened for me to do an internship in 2014, like a pastoral internship in Washington, D.C. That kind of cemented some of my personal convictions about what is a church, like what is church leadership, these kind of things. And so then I just was like, I'll just say yes whenever a door opens to preach or whenever a door, and that eventually led to a church asking me to come and serve as their pastor.
That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing, brother. Yeah. That's it's a really beautiful journey that the Lord has led you. Yeah.
Praise the Lord.
So related to worship now.
Okay.
Help start us out with your definition of what worship is, and talk a little bit about your theology of worship.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of a definition, since I knew you were going to ask that, I gave thought to it. I don't necessarily have like a paper definition, but a thing I tend to like to think about and emphasize is that, one, worship is responding to the worthiness of God, but it's responding to the worthiness of God in a worthy manner. And so then we have to, how are we going to define that? If I'm responding to the worthiness of God, how is the worthiness of God made known? I'd say the worthiness of God according to his word. So responding to the worthiness of God according to his word, and responding in a worthy manner according to his word. Why I find that helpful is, when I first became a Christian, worship was me trying to get myself worked up and excited while the music played, right? And that was the climax, the pinnacle experience of worship. But scripture starts to kind of round out your understanding of worship, like when Isaiah is exposed to the glory of God and his response is to confess his own unworthiness. I think that was a worthy response, right? He responded in a worthy manner to seeing the worthiness of God. And so confession of sin can be a worthy response, just as much as, the people of Israel crossing over the Red Sea and singing and dancing and shouting over their redemption. Well, that was a worthy response to the worthiness of the God who just redeemed them. We see these pictures in Revelation, like what's a worthy response to the Lamb who was slain, right? But who's clothed us, clothed us and gathered us in glory. And so, I think I like to try and figure out how worship has many facets to it, in terms of what aspect of God's worthiness is being revealed. Is his justice being revealed? Is his mercy being revealed? Is his holiness being revealed? And there's different times where it seems in Scripture, God's people respond differently, both depending on what aspect of God's glory is being put on display, but also what is the condition the people are in when they are encountering God. And so I think all of that kind of fits into my thinking on worship.
Yeah, that's good. So what are some of those unworthy manners that either you see in your own heart and life, in other churches, or that believers just struggle with, or maybe even some churches promote unworthy ways of responding to God in worship?
Well, I think sometimes we want the fruit of an encounter with God more than we want an encounter with God. And so we're like, oh, the fruit of an encounter with God should be joy. And so we aim our worship towards how can we get people to feel joy, but we are just focused on trying to get joyful and not what should produce joy in us. And so I think sometimes we're trying, I remember when I was really young in my faith, I just had an awesome encounter with just that feeling of the near presence of God. I remember the next day, I showed up early to the chapel. It was like at a youth camp. And I'm like, okay, my hands are antennas. And if I can direct them in the right way, I'm going to get the signal and I'm going to experience what I just experienced. So I was not focused on who is the God I'm worshiping. I was focused on how do I recreate that experience that I just had. And I think worshiping for the purpose of having an experience is something that we can all tend to, and we start chasing that. And it's like, okay, if the thing that used to give us an experience is no longer giving us experience, we try to find something new. And we're searching for what's going to give me that. And so people will go from, it used to be like the rock and band, now it's tradition, now it's this. And it's like, what's going to give me this experience? But I think we're just putting our focus on the wrong thing. And if we put our focus on God, when we encounter him for who he is, the appropriate response begins bubbling up in our hearts. And sometimes it takes time for that next response to explode. It doesn't always have to be an explosion. Sometimes it's just me being re-humbled again. And I may not be humbled to the degree I was humbled the last time I was humbled, but that doesn't mean I'm not being humbled, right? And so I think one way we can get it wrong is we're looking for the fruit of encountering God instead of focusing on simply encountering God. I think another way we get it wrong, or we can do it in an unworthy manner, I think of just 1 Corinthians 11, how they were partaking of the Lord's Supper in an unworthy manner. And what people can often miss in that is it's because they had no concern for one another, right? And so we can place such an emphasis on having a personal experience that the worshiper thinks it is about my personal experience with God, and they disconnect from actually this is a shared experience with God. And I might have to slow down so that someone else can catch up, or I might need to speed up so that I can be with others, right? But it's like we're encountering God together. It's not just a bunch of individuals encountering God on their own and on their own terms. Many times, God's people we see in Scripture, they encounter God together. They experience something. Fear fell upon the whole church. Awe fell upon the whole church. The church was confessing their sins, right? The church was singing praises. And so that, I think, is something where we can get so focused on what we think we need or we want from God that we miss out on what is God doing in us as a people, and how are we experiencing him together? Yeah.
So around the conversation of worship, a lot of emphasis is put on that leader, that worship leader, whether you're a church planner and you're like, I got to do my first hire. I'm going to find like the cool up and coming worship leader, skinny jeans and all. And he's going to create that strong Sunday gathering and draw people in. Do we give too much emphasis to that worship leader position? And how do you as a planter think through like finding a qualified worship leader? What do you look for?
Yeah, I mean, one, I think if I'm reading the New Testament letters, it's hard for me to imagine that the churches were prioritizing with their finances. How can we find, someone who can just, lead our music, right? I think like almost you take any community of like 50 to 100 people, somebody in that community knows how to play an instrument, right? Whoever can play it the most skillfully within that community.
I got 3 chords.
Yeah.
Right?
You know, and my thing is, I find it amazing. I look at so now we can go into the Psalms and we can talk about that, but let's just start with the New Testament. The New Testament churches greet one another with psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. It seems like an exhortation that's to the whole congregation that even if we didn't have a music leader, we as a congregation could still obey that command. We could still greet one another with psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. We could say, hey, let's sing Great is Thy Faithfulness together. I do a service at a senior center on Thursdays. I lead the music because most of the elderly saints, even if they used to be able to play an instrument, it's difficult for them. I can't play any instrument, just lead them a cappella, right? And I don't think our worship is diminished by that. So I think sometimes it's if there's too much prominence put on the worship leader, it becomes harder for the congregation to find its voice because its voice needs to be tuned to the style and leadership of that worship leader. And so I tend to prefer multiple leaders, right, that are representative of just the congregation, who are the people that God has placed in this body. But then I think also, if we rush too fast in, say, a hiring situation just to find the most gifted worship leader we can find, we end up putting so much emphasis on giftedness. And I wonder have we taken time to vet, does this person live as a example to the rest of the congregation, right? Is their giftedness kind of overshadowing who they are as a person? And are we putting more emphasis on giftedness than who we are as a people? And so I don't have qualifications in the New Testament for worship leader. I've got qualifications for elders and deacons. At the very least, I think a worship leader, we should at least be looking at the qualifications of deacons, and we should be asking, not just is this person gifted to lead music, but are they a person of commendable character that would still be a servant example to the rest of the congregation? And so I think those kind of qualifications are there. So it's like one could make an argument that like no, a pastor should be leading. And if they want to make that argument because there's words, okay, well then maybe we're looking for a worship leader that's meeting the elder qualifications. But I think at the very least, they are a servant of the church. They are helping the church to sing to one another. And if they're going to be a servant of the church, we should be recognizing them not just in light of their giftedness, but in light of, do they have the qualifications of a servant of the church? Yeah.
That's really helpful.
Yeah, that's great. I remember years back, there was a very public Christian leader who fell, and commenting on this, another Christian leader said that we can often confuse or mistake giftedness or talent with having the gifts of the Spirit. And so often we're like, oh, well, how well can he play? How charismatic is he? How good does he look up there? And so, that can definitely be to the detriment of the church.
Well, we do that, it's easy to focus on that with music, but right, we do that with pastors as well, right? And, I often just compare the giftedness versus godliness, right?
Yeah.
And when you look at the qualifications for elders, you have able to teach, right? Like that's the bar we're aiming for, able to teach, and all the rest of it is character. And we can just be like, able to teach / excellent public speaker, and assumption if excellent public speaker must also meet all these other things because these we see as lower on the totem pole. But when you read the Apostle Paul's writings, like when he calls the elders to Miletus to meet with him, he's like, you know how I lived among you. You read 1 Peter 5, as an example to the flock. You read Paul's exhortations to Timothy and 2 Timothy, being an example to the believers in your speech and in your conduct. And it's so easy for us to confuse. They do good when they're up front, and that must mean they are a model Christian for us. And that equation doesn't actually work. And I think we need to actually put more emphasis and more attention on how is this person living among others as an example to them, because most Christians, their Christianity is not going to be expressed by standing up in a pulpit and preaching a sermon.
Sure.
Their Christianity is not going to be expressed by grabbing an instrument and leading the congregation. Their Christianity is going to be expressed by how do they speak to other people?
Yeah.
How do they live their lives? And so if the people who are leading us are not also living as an example to us, it gives the impression that our giftedness is what makes us effective as a Christian. But it's like the gifts are just the things we use to serve others, right? But if there's no character behind those gifts, it really can become superficial and shallow.
Yeah. That's great.
In the long run, the pragmatism backfires, right? Because you put forward these gifted and talented people, and then they blow up their lives, or they leave the faith, and then they take people with them. There's a whole trail of harm that they cause, because in the short run, we got a bigger crowd to show up because they were talented.
Yeah. So I wanted to look back at the corporate worship component, and I've seen Beautiful Eulogy live, and I mean, it was a hip hop show.
Yeah,
it's loud. There's a great vibe. There's stage lights. People are jumping. People are stoked to be there. Is it common for a regular Sunday morning worship service to resemble the feel of a concert, or at least aim for that vibe?
Should
quote
it?
Unquote.
Yeah, well, here's what's interesting. So when Beautiful Eulogy was touring, say we came to a city, in our most active times, we might have come to a city once or twice, right? So once or twice throughout the course of a year. In most cases, once a year or once every other year, right? So this is not a 52-week thing. I think like if you came to the same Beautiful Eulogy show 52 weeks in a row, I think you would have a declining audience, right? It's like, okay, we get it, right? But while there was genuine worship taking place at those concerts, the reality is there was a lot of emphasis on the performers. There was a lot of emphasis on Beautiful Eulogy. And the way you know this is because after the show, we'd hang out at the merchandise table. What would people do? They would line up to take pictures with us, right? Because that's the era we were doing shows in. I mean, I remember literally my cheek muscles hurting at the end of the night because I smiled for so many pictures, right? And so that shows you something different is happening here. Now, I'm not even saying that it's necessarily vain. I understand why. If I'm somebody, I listened to some music, it really blessed me, it really encouraged me. Here's that person. I get to express my gratitude to them in person. And yeah, I can take pictures with my cell phone now, so I want to take a picture. That's all fine. What I can say about the Sunday morning for the people who are members of the church that I'm a part of, people are not lining up to take a picture with me at the end of the service, right? And that is to say, worship is occurring, but it's not about the performers, right? It's not about the performers. And really, the people who come to the Beautiful Eulogy show, you're a fan of Beautiful Eulogy, you're a fan of Beautiful Eulogy, someone dragged you along to this. You're all having the same experience, but you're not really connecting with one another. You're connecting with the performer, right? I think for a local church where all these individuals are assembled, they're connecting with the performer, but they're not connecting with one another. I think you have a concert, you don't have a church, right? Yeah. And so I don't want to intentionally create that environment. Yeah. I want the congregation to come and the people who are leading them, helping them to connect with one another, not to connect with the people who are leading them, and so I think that's a big difference. And so even getting to the idea of greeting one another with songs, hymns, and spiritual songs, it's like, man, my favorite instrument for corporate worship is the vocal cords of redeemed sinners, Amen. Right? And it's like, drop out, it was funny, the guy who led for us last Sunday, he was like, hey, did I do too much a cappella? Because he's like, I think I ended every song a cappella. I was like, brother, you can't do it too much a cappella for me, because if you did the whole service a cappella, I'd be fine with it, right? Because that's my favorite part. But you just have to discern the songs. Some songs work better a cappella, some work better with instrumentation. But I think in one sense, a concert is, if it's worship, right, it is focused on God and it is focused on the performer, right? Sure. I think for a congregation assembled for worship, it should be focused on God and focused on one another.
Yeah.
And the way we lead can foster one or the other in terms of result. Yeah.
No, that's a great distinction. Super, super helpful. But even if we understand all of that, and if we wrap our heads around it, there is still this this choice that is made by every congregation, every worship pastor, worship leader on, what musical style is appropriate here, what's going to be a blessing, and even if all of the intentions are right and everything is in its right place, you're still making certain decisions along the way. So I wanted to ask you, what role do you feel like contextualization or broader cultural influence, or even, framing it in the best possible light of like, we just want to reach people. We want for this music to be as accessible as possible. What role does contextualization or a desire to reach our neighbors, those outside the walls of this church, what role does that play?
I mean, one, I don't think we should think of our music as our primary evangelistic vehicle, right? If anything, our people who are assembled together to worship God, it is them going back out into the world, being sent back out into the world, and it is their lived lives before others that should be our primary evangelistic strategy. I think cultural context is really challenging for us in the Western world, right? Because it's not like, even in most of our neighborhoods, it's not like we have this shared cultural, this is the style of music we all listen to. Sometimes I bemoan this. I'm like, I was recently at a concert of like Irish pub songs, right? And it's just like, this is a very distinct culture. Everyone who grows up, young or old, they know what it is, and it has a certain feel to it. And I'm like, no, in my neighborhood, like culturally, and for me being a hip hop dude, it's like I have such a distinct cultural flavor and taste from most of the neighbors in my present neighborhood, right? So it's much harder to be like, oh yeah, just do what is, normal for the people of your culture. It's like, what is normal for the people of our culture? They have Spotify, and like you could have 10 houses in a row and all of their Spotify playlists would look completely different. I think a lot of times though, what comes into the conversation is the talk of diversity, right? How are we going to have diverse expressions? And a lot of times we think of cultural diversity, but I think one thing that is easy to miss is generational diversity, right? And because that's diversity as well, right? And you can have some churches where they are maybe so traditional that like the old people are kind of like used to singing their songs a certain kind of way that a young person who is new to that church would be like, I don't even know how to join into this, right? But on the flip side, you could have another church that is so contemporary and so like engaged with kind of modern, say, rock style that it's like a senior who's never been in that environment would come in and be like, I don't even know how to join along with you. And so I think the need for diversity in any given congregation that is not just cultural diversity, but also generational diversity. And there is something very timeless about songs that have lasted more than 2 decades, right? And so I'm not saying only sing hymns from the Reformation or whatever, but it's like we're in the English language, right? So there are songs that have been around in the English language that have lasted for generations. I think there's a great value to singing those, no matter what culture or no matter what, you're uniting you're uniting yourself and your context to not just what's happening now, but what God has been doing in generations prior. But yeah, I think we just make it, sometimes it's easy to make it just more complicated than it needs to be. I mean, I think the culture of a church, it is a slowly developed thing. So maybe like hiring the certain musician who sets a certain kind of tone and like, this is the flavor and we try and grow into that. It's like, how long are we going to stay excited about that? Like it's going to waver over time. We can't just create that. That's that idea. Like, okay, we want our first service to be like, just through the roof excitement. I'm like, can you sustain that for 6 years? Probably not. And so there's something that's just very joyful about picking a song where the words are true and we can all sing them who are in the room. Well, here's a song, the words are true and we can all sing it. Let's sing it together.
Yeah.
And it's like, I think you could have 5 churches that start with that like conviction. Let's find songs with words that are true that we are able to sing, and go 5 years later, and those 5 churches would not have the same exact songbook, right? But they all were kind of aiming to do the same thing. Let's sing true words, let's find true words that we're able to sing together.
Yeah.
And I think your cultural context, you're going to learn, oh, we struggle to sing songs like this. We really do well singing songs like this. Well, lean into that. Keep doing that, cultivating that, or learn how to sing songs that are more harder for you. Maybe you have to do it more than once, But, those are some of the core, I think, convictions. And it's just like where we're in the commercialized aspect of music, everybody has their preferences and all these things. But I think in the most general sense, are the words true and can we sing them? Let's sing them together. I'm like, I'll sing with you, brother.
Yeah.
I'll sing with you, sister. I won't sing something that's not true, but if it's true, I'll sing it with you.
So even the singability thing is so interesting. I feel like a lot of modern popular worship music is far less singable. And even the distinctive sound in maybe a larger church kind of style of worship is the music, and you can't even hear yourself singing, let alone your neighbor singing. Mm-hmm. So would you say like that's even an artistic decision, right?
Yeah.
How singable is this song?
Well, what we have, I think this is kind of, it's interesting what you're pointing at is a lot of what we have, say, on radio or what gets popular is bands who are performing in stadiums, right? And so what works in a stadium and what works for 100 people is different. And so it's like, yeah, sure, you got 10,000 people in an arena and we're shouting at the top of our lungs while like this music's coming through loudspeakers. But like you put me in a room and this like amp and this electric guitar is wailing and it's louder than any human voice can project in the size of that room. And you want me to like belt at the top of my lungs, but at the same time, like I'm not with thousands of people. I'm with like my, Bob, who's 67. Am I going to shout at him right now? You know what I mean? And it's like, it doesn't fit the environment, right? We're not in a stadium right now. So why are we emulating the sound of a stadium when we're just 100 people? And so it's in some ways takes away from the intimacy of the very moment that we're experiencing, because we're trying to do what somebody would do leading a stadium when really we're leading a very small crowd. And so I think that's instructive. But yeah, when it comes to singability, if your lead singer is just like soaring and, able to hold a note, for 45 seconds, and like the rest of us, like, I can't do that, right? And so in some ways, I'm being excluded from participating, or my participation is simply through appreciating. And now I'm not greeting one another with psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. I'm just like, go on, Susan, that's great. Do your thing. Man, ain't Susan great? I love how Susan let that one out. No offense to any Susans out there. I just picked a name, but yeah.
Yeah, Susans tend to be pretty gracious. So
yeah, exactly. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As kind of a follow-up to that, speaking of artistry, so although you love to sing and although you are a musician, that's not what you do every Sunday, at least, as your primary thing. What you are doing Sunday to Sunday is you're preaching to your church. Talk to me a little bit about the philosophy behind, the presentation or the performance, if you will, of preaching. What role do art, creativity play in effective preaching? Is it important, or is it just a matter of open the Bible, read the Bible, preach the Bible, get off the stage?
Yeah, I mean, I've struggled with that, and I think if I wasn't clear enough, because we're kind of going everywhere, I want to say, by no means do I think I'm an expert when it comes to how to lead a congregation in song or whatever. So I think we're trying to look at certain convictions, right? And what are some of the distinctions? And so that can be really helpful. But the reality is, the last 6.5 years of my life, every Sunday I've been gathered with the 100 or so saints of Saving Grace Church. So I can speak kind of in general sense to things that are going on, but it's I've not been a part of every church that's out there, and it's easy to formulate caricatures. So I just want to make that note. I don't really have any caricatures in mind. I think some of the things we're talking about, though, in terms of giftedness over godliness, these are things. It doesn't matter what tradition you're coming from, whatever. These are things for all of us to be aware of, and no matter what camp you're in, we've all fallen victim to that trap. So I want to articulate that. When it comes to preaching, yeah, I really, because I experienced the bad examples of emphasis on giftedness over godliness, I really struggled with what should my preaching be? What should my preaching style be? What are good examples for me to emulate? And I think in my own caution, I think I erred on the side of caution, and I kind of resorted to just open the Bible, just kind of say what it says, be as clear as I can, and leave it at that. And maybe certain aspects of my creativity were coming out, but not because I was trying to. And I think it hasn't changed a lot, only that I am giving myself more permission to think through how am I intentionally bringing this to bear. And I think when I think of creativity, sometimes what we do is we take the create out of creativity. We just leave the ivity, and it's creativity is creating things, right? And when something is created, it's created with an intention, with a purpose. So if I am using creativity in a sermon, before I can do that well, I need to understand what is the intention or what is the purpose of this sermon. And if the Word of God is going to set the agenda, then really I need to know the text I'm preaching, right? And I can't be creative with the text until I know what the text means. Now, once I know what the text means, I think the other thing, especially if I'm a pastor in a local church, I also need to know my audience, right? So I need to know my text and I need to know my audience. And now my creativity is, how am I going to bring the purpose and intention of this text to bear on this group of people? Now it's man, would it be more helpful if I started this sermon with a story? Would it be more helpful if I started the sermon acknowledging, hey, this is going to be hard for us to work through right now, right? Knowing the people is going to impact my tone. Does this need to be more of a rebuke? Does this need to be more of an encouragement, right? And so the text is determining that, but also my audience is determining that. And so now, once I know what is the point of the text and who are the people that I'm bringing that text to, now I can start thinking, what is the most effective way I could do that, right? And every preacher has different tools in their toolkit, right? But you're not focused on what tools do I have. You're focused on what am I trying to accomplish? And now I'm using those tools to accomplish that. Because there's a sense in which if one of your tools is you've got this golden hammer, if we're not trying to pound in a nail, I don't care if you have a golden hammer. Like, that's a cool hammer, but it's not helping to accomplish what needs to happen right now. So is the tool being used to help accomplish the purpose and intention of the text before us? And I think that opens it up for me. And I am using creativity as a tool, hopefully to be more clear. So it's like, okay, there might be a disconnect between I'm preaching from a minor prophet, right? And for my people, the simple reading of the text, they get a sense of what it means, but it's not clear. Creativity now in my communication is, how can I make this clear of what does this mean for my people today, right? That's going to take some mental work for me to figure out how to communicate this, that they are going to benefit from it. And so now I'm not necessarily just, I'm not just trying to be creative for the sake of being creative. I'm using my creative gifts to help accomplish the goal of bringing this text to bear on the audience that's in front of me.
Yeah. How do you personally build that muscle or like develop that tool so it's in the tool belt of preaching?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things. I think one, what I love is recognizing that different people have different kinds of gifts and different kinds of tools, So, when you start talking about in the realm of preaching, the thing that is easy for us to just forget is just as, the rule of like the 10,000 hours, the getting in the repetitions. I mean, my sermons today are better than they were 6.5 years ago. And it's because I've been doing it for 6.5 years. And so some of my tools have developed through the practice. Now, is there situations where people can be preaching for a long time and not grow? I think, yeah, especially if they don't have a clear objective or a clear goal, or if they keep jumping from just fad to fad, it's going to be hard to grow because you're going to use something and then it's going to become an outdated mode and then you're going to use something. But if you're just trying to grow as a communicator, right? Trying to grow in how can I not just get the text right, but get it across. And so something that's really helped me is the Simeon Trust workshops. I go to those every year, like spring training, and it helped me to recover some of the homiletical things that I wasn't sure how I should use them or how was appropriate to use them. It's helped recover that for me, right? And it's helped me to do so in a way where I'm still grounded in my text. And so it's funny because sometimes my creativity is this text tells us to love our enemies. And the point I'm going to make in this sermon is love your enemies, right? Like that's the point I'm going to make. It's like, now, does that mean it's going to be devoid of creativity? Well, no, I'm going to immerse myself in, so it's, in one sense, I need to know my text, I need to know my audience, but I think also I need to let the text come to bear on me. One of the things that would happen in Beautiful Eulogy, like when we were writing these like theological raps, that the song still had emotion, what I would have to do, sometimes like I'm writing a song, I'd have to study for 10 hours so that I could write the textbook definition. And I could not emote on that topic until I understood what I was emoting about, right? But once I understood what I was emoting about, okay, now I'm writing a song, I'm not writing a textbook definition. So now that I understand what I'm trying to talk about, now how is this truth impacting me and how does that impact the way that I communicate it, right? And if it's not impacting me, why should I expect that it's going to impact anybody else, right? Now, you can overdo that, right? But it's just the idea of reading a text and starting to ask, what impact should this have on people's lives? And now, how can I bring this to bear so that with the goal of it having that impact, Now for me, there might be some things because of my background in music that may become natural and like in terms of a practical sense of like, yeah, how do you grow in these things? Some people will say like, people who are preachers, they should read poetry, for example, like read classical works of poetry or whatever.
So like maybe your alliteration is a little better. Are you always like, okay, all these 4 points start with S?
Yeah, I think alliteration, some people excel at alliteration. I think that's fine. I like to add just to that. It's just like, man, if you're going to have points, like let there be some substance to them, if the point doesn't really mean anything and it's just a word that starts with the same letter as another word, I don't know that I'm helping my people to understand, so even when you get into the realm of beauty, yes, I want my preaching in some cases to be beautiful, but not always. Sometimes I want my preaching to be ugly because what I'm talking about is ugly, right? Mm-hmm. Like I want my preaching to reflect the way the text should feel. And so in that sense, if we should be trembling right now, then I don't want to preach in a way that's making us jump up and down, right? And if we should be jumping up and down, I don't want to be preaching in a way that makes us want to fall asleep. You know what I'm saying? Like I want to handle the thing in a way that is appropriate for the kind of response that it should be producing in people. But yeah, reading poetry, I think one other way it helps is just learning the economy of words, right? Because in a poetic stanza, you're not writing clunky sentences, you're writing, shorter lines. And I think it's easy for preachers who they've done all this academic work to then write their sermons with these very long and elaborate sentences. But it's like you're orating right now. People are not reading your sermon. They're listening to it. And so the simple reading of poetry kind of trains you. How can I say this in a more succinct way so that my audience can hear it and hold on to it? And if I've given them like a clunky, even like Pauline kind of sentence, from the pulpit, it's like, unless I'm going to give them my manuscript, because Paul was writing letters, you can go back and read that complex sentence over and over again, right? But you can't do that with my sermon. You're receiving it verbally. And really, like, thankfully, like, the greatest at this is Jesus, right? You like look and the economy of words with which he uses to make his point. If he gives an illustration or a parable, he doesn't just add all these unnecessary details and trimmings or whatever. He gets it to where you know what he's talking about, you understand it, and then he makes his point. So you go away from like the parable of the persistent widow. He's like, here, Luke gives us the details so that they would, continue steadfast in prayer and not give up. He told them this parable, and it's like, he just gives you the details you need in order to understand the point. And I think it's easy to just get lost in the weeds. You spend this time studying, you get all these ideas, but it's like, what's the intention? What's the purpose? And how can I bring that to bear on my hearer? And so, yeah, anyway, reading poetry can be a way of learning the economy of words, which I'm not modeling necessarily in my dialogue because I'm just shooting from the hip here. So, yeah.
You don't do like spontaneous battle raps where we can just give you like a few different topics and you'll just wax eloquent?
No, every time I look in the mirror and I try and say, like, could I even look in the mirror and be like, hey, yo, I can't take myself serious. And, when I did music full time, it wasn't like I was writing, performing every single day, right? That's not what I do every single day now. It takes a lot more work for me to like get in that headspace. Because like right now, I'm being a husband, I'm being a father, I'm being a pastor, and it's like whatever's left over, comes after that. But those three things take up most of my, mental and emotional bandwidth.
Well worth your energy.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's great.
Yeah. So give our audience a handoff about how to get a hold of you, Saving Grace Church. If you have a music project that you want to share about, feel free just to kind of let people know how they can find out more or follow what you're doing?
SavingGraceChurch.com is the website of our congregation. We're in the Milwaukee area. So yeah, if you're local, you ever want to visit us, feel free to do that. Most social media, I don't do much on social media, so I'm probably not a very exciting person to follow. But it's just Brian Braille. So my first name, Bryan, Braille with my artist name. I made a little bit of music this year. I had a sabbatical last year. And so I just tried to make songs because I was trying not to expend my energy elsewhere. I was like, maybe I'm going to start making music more. But then like once I was off sabbatical, I realized, no, husband, father, pastor, so yeah, there's, musical endeavors are sparse for me. I'll probably still like dabble in it every now and then. So you can find music, some solo stuff that I've made under Braille, some group stuff I've made under Beautiful Eulogy. And if you go to our church's website, you can get a hold of me there as well.
Yeah. Awesome, brother. It's been great having you. We really appreciate you taking the time.
My pleasure. Thank you guys for having me.
Thanks, Brian. Great to connect, brother.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much for joining us for this episode of Jesus in the Upper Left. We want to ask you a quick favor. Would you please subscribe so you don't miss a single episode, and share with those that are in your life that might benefit from the content. Hit the notifications button, rate and review, of course, and then head on over to upperleftshow.com where you can find bonus content, opportunities to connect with those around the city that are doing similar work as you, resources to help you, and just a way to connect to the community. We hope to see you again next time.